You may recall last week that we said all the spiritual tasks that we're going to be looking at have to do with three components of the life structure: work, love relationship, and meaning, or faith, or sense of ultimate value. Well, this third spiritual task deals with that last component. What will be the personal religious faith and belief I will build my life upon? Now, I believe that of all the spiritual tasks we've looked at, this is often the one that gets overlooked. There has been a little bit of research done about the stages and phases of faith development. Most of that research has been done by a theologian by the name of James Fowler, who presently works and teaches at Emory University. For the last several years, he has done extensive interviews with several hundred people of varying backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, different age groups, and has tried to make some suggestions about how our faith changes and develops as we move through life. One of his suggestions that I think is extremely sound is this: up until about the mid-20s in our lives, for most people, faith or religious belief remains very conventional. Very conventional. I don't mean to use the word pejoratively, but by conventional I mean this: our faith is very much conformed to the significant others in our lives, whoever they might be. Our faith, our beliefs, and our values is very much conformed by and dependent upon our parents, if they happen to be the significant others. Or it may be very conformed to our peers, if they happen to be the significant others in our lives. Or it may be conformed to religious authorities, pope, bishop, minister, priest, etc., whomever, if they happen to be significant others in our lives. At that point, our faith is not a personal faith. It's fundamentally dependent upon externals. It has not yet become personal. And so the spiritual task that one must undertake in the early years of adulthood is to begin by dealing with my own personal experience to make decisions about what values and what faith I personally can ascribe to. Now, let me suggest that this is really nothing new. I think we find pretty much the same theme in a lot of spiritual classics, and the person who perhaps more than anyone else has clearly written about this is St. Teresa of Avila. As you may know, St. Teresa of Avila, 16th century spiritual writer, talks about the spiritual journey as a movement through 7 mansions. And the 7th mansion is the one where we encounter in its fullness the reality of God, Christ the King. However, in her system of thought, the major transition is the transition from the 3rd mansion to the 4th. And she suggests that many people live their entire lives in the 3rd mansion. And it's the mansion of conventional faith. It's good faith, but it's conventional faith, not yet personal. And I would like to read to you, if I might, just a few lines from her interior castle, where she describes what persons look like as they live this conventional faith. She sometimes refers to the 3rd mansion as the mansion of the exemplary life, where the person is doing all the right things. This is what she says: I believe that through the Lord's goodness there are many such souls in the world. They are most desirous not to offend His Majesty. They avoid committing even venial sins. They love doing penance. They spend hours in recollection. They use their time well. They practice works of charity toward their neighbors. And they are very careful in their speech and dress and in the government of their household if they have one. This is certainly a desirable state, and there seems no reason why they should be denied entrance to the very last of mansions, nor will the Lord deny them this if they desire it, for their disposition is such that He will grant them any favor. Now, it's rather interesting. She describes the exemplary religious person, but notice she says this is only the 3rd mansion. There are limitations to this way of life. And she goes on to describe what they are. And the first is, people who live their life in a conventional faith stance tend to become overconfident. They oftentimes believe that God's will in their life can be reduced to certain rules and norms and regulations. They tend to become overconfident and then frequently judgmental of others. St. Teresa says, oftentimes they think they can teach others what they should do. And it leads to a growing judgmental kind of attitude. That's a limitation. A second limitation that she talks about, and that Fowler also talks about with conventional faith, is autonomy of judgment is jeopardized. I lose the capacity to make my own decisions. I tend, without thinking about it, to give authority over to other persons. And in the extreme, I think we can say we get a situation like the one a few years ago. I'm sure you're all familiar with the Guyana tragedy, the Jim Jones tragedy, where several hundred people lost their lives basically because their autonomy of judgment had been jeopardized. They had given their authority over to this man, Jim Jones, even to the point of taking their own lives. That's a conventional faith. So autonomy of judgment has been jeopardized. That's a limitation of this particular stage. So what is it then that enables a person to begin to move to what we're calling personal faith? And I'd like to suggest two things. First of all, I begin to take seriously the questions and the doubts that rise up within me. I begin to allow myself to recognize that the beliefs I have held to this point do not always match my own experience. And that gives rise to questions and doubts. And if I receive the questions and hear the doubts and listen to what is being revealed to me through those, that's passage to a personal faith. That's passage into the fourth mansion, as Teresa describes it. Now, just to exemplify this tonight, I would like to share with you, if I might, a brief excerpt from a case study that was done by a student of mine who did an extensive interview over several hours with a person, a young woman, and then began to reflect on her faith journey as he understood it. He described what I think, to me, sounds very much like the conventional faith that we're talking about, and the difficulty of moving from that to a personal faith. This is how he summarized her story. He writes, Anne, which is a fictitious name, went on to say that she perceived her father to be a very holy man. She said he was a good Catholic, went to daily Mass, followed the 10 Commandments, went on annual retreats, and advised strongly that she and her brother do the same. One final point concerning her father. Anne stated that whenever in life there might be a question of how one was to live or to act, her father told her to follow the exact teaching of the Catholic Church. If she followed the teaching of the Church, she would be always doing the right thing. She should never question this. It would only get her into trouble. And we might add, it will also keep her in the third mansion. Now, it's that resistance to questioning, to doubt, to uncertainty that does, in fact, fixate a person at what Teresa calls the third mansion, or what we're also calling conventional faith. So one must begin to believe that God oftentimes does reveal himself to us, speak to us through the questions that rise up within us. And if I begin to allow my own experience to speak to me in that way, then I begin to develop conscience. And with the development of conscience, I'm arriving at personal faith. Now, I think the second thing that's also necessary in order to establish a personal faith is the ability to live with tension. The ability to live with tension. And the tension that oftentimes comes from being within a group and yet not agreeing with a group. Being in a church and yet not always assenting to the public beliefs of that church, because my own personal faith deviates in some way. And to have a personal established faith means that I will have to live with tension, to be both within a community and yet not perfectly or totally or absolutely defined by that community. And all of that requires a strong identity. So if I don't have the identity, I will not be able to establish a personal faith. If I might, I'd like to read one other example of this. This is an example, I think, of a person who was very much negotiating this passage into the fourth mansion, who was very clearly, but also very painfully, establishing a personal faith. This also is a case study done by a student of mine. This was a case study done of a religious woman in her 50s at the time that the study was done. And the student describes her sojourn into deeper faith in her 20s. And this is how he describes it. Another turning point occurred in her early 20s when she experienced a severe faith crisis, doubting not only the existence of God, but her or anyone's ability to find the truth. She was attending a Dominican college at the time, minoring in philosophy, while she searched out her own answers. Being an avid student, she read from Plato, Aristotle, through to Thomas Aquinas, to Descartes, Kant, Voltaire, as well as the moderns, including Freud. Eventually, she threw out everything she had ever learned about God, decided that though he did exist and was alive, he was essentially unknowable. That was all she had to go on, or would go on. Now her questioning stance continued, and by her early 30s, she was questioning everything about religious life. She was a sister. The rules, the lifestyle, especially in terms of her own sexuality. She decided that it was simply unhealthy to have only women to relate with. And given these questions and the insights to which they had led her, she was in the process of making the decision to leave when a close friend of hers died of cancer at age 33. This had a profound effect upon her, causing her to pause and look once more for the meaning of it all. Now, I'll stop there. It gets very interesting from that point on. But I think that much illustrates what it oftentimes means to move to a personal faith. And it does mean to go into what I believe St. John of the Cross describes as the dark night. And it's an experience of almost losing one's faith, because the faith I previously knew is no longer with me. I can no longer live by that faith, and I must begin to carve out my own, as dictated by the Holy Spirit alone. And that is a turbulent time. St. Teresa of Avila says when she was moving into this fourth mansion, the mansion of personal responsibility for faith, she says, at times I wanted to take vengeance on myself because I felt as if I had lost my faith. And it was only later that she discovered she was beginning to find it anew. So I believe that that is a major task of these years. And the last thing I would like to say is that oftentimes, if a person does not negotiate this task, what clearly begins to happen is their faith life becomes mechanical, routinish, and almost detached from their day-to-day life. A person may go to church every Sunday, and yet in reality, their faith life has very little to do with their day-to-day life. It has become too mechanical. And that is the result of not quite resolving this spiritual task. If James Fowler's studies are correct, he suggests that the majority of people, this is very tentative, that the majority of people do not really seem to satisfactorily resolve this spiritual task throughout the duration of their lifetime and remain living a largely conventional faith. Okay, so that's the third task I would like to mention. That leaves us two more tonight. And the last two I'll deal with a little bit more briefly. They're somewhat different from the others in as much as they have to do with specific moments or sets of years within this adult period. And the first of these last two tasks, the fourth one I'd like to consider tonight, is really taken from Daniel Levinson's studies. And that task is this: to negotiate the age 30 transition. Now, what does this mean? Well, what Daniel Levinson concluded from his studies was this: it seems very important in the lives of men, and I think also women, that roughly around age 30, and again this is very tentative, it becomes vitally important for them to reevaluate their life structure, to just see how they stand at this stage of the game. And oftentimes the kinds of questions that seem to break into consciousness at this time are questions like this. What have I done thus far with my life? Or questions like, is this what I expected? And usually the answer is no, in one respect or another. Or questions like, am I doing what I ought to do or what I really want to do? And those kind of questions seem to impel a looking back at one's life up to this time and reassessing how well I have done. Have I established occupation and work? Have I established love relationship? Have I established a personal faith yet? It's time to do some reevaluating. Obviously, what frustrates the negotiation of this task very frequently is I keep submerging the questions. I don't allow myself to begin to really hear those questions rising up within me. Now, in my mind, a great example of a person struggling with this is a friend of mine who I remember talking to a number of years ago when he was 32. But he was a man who, in his early 20s, had a very promising career ahead of him. He was a very intelligent man, and he went to a university in Texas to study astrophysics. And he entered into the NASA program, the space aeronautics program at that time, and right when he was completing his PhD degree in astrophysics, the bottom fell out of the space program. He could not get a job at NASA at all. He had to take a job with a company that suddenly transferred him far out west. In the meantime, he had gotten married. He and his wife were both in their early 20s at the time. They moved out west. He became involved in this new company. They started building a family. And I remember talking to him when he was 32. There he was out west, married, in a job that was really not the one he had studied and trained for, with 5 children. And I can remember as clear as a bell his saying to me, the only phrase I can think of to sum up my life right now is, I feel trapped. I feel trapped. He was very much feeling the age 30 transition as he looked at his job. It was not the kind of job he really wanted. He was not living in the place that he wanted to live in. His family and friends were far back east, and suddenly he had 5 children. The family was growing. For him, at least, it was the beginning of reassessing his life structure. How much of that could he change? How much of that could he alter? Well, definite limits to that. But he did begin to make some changes. For example, 5 children was enough. That's one decision that became eminently clear. So he was very much about the business of trying to do this age 30 transition. Another example that comes to my mind, I remember talking to a married couple. They were married when they were 25 and 24. Been married 7 years. And I can remember how they told me they celebrated their 7th wedding anniversary. And that is, they stayed at home at night, they got rid of all the kids, and they sat in the living room for 3 hours and talked about the things they would have to change in their relationship if they were going to stay together 7 more years. Now, they obviously had a sense that there was some fine-tuning, at least, that their relationship needed, that things were not perfect. They were already feeling that unsettledness. So they began to do the age 30 transition, if you will, to reevaluate one's life structure and to make necessary adjustments. So that is a task central also to the years of early adulthood. Now that leads me then to the last task I would like to share with you tonight. And this is one that pertains much more to the late years in this period, pretty much to the mid and late 30s. And it's a task that really is drawn very much from Daniel Levinson's studies. And that is to settle down or to settle in. It's a rather curious phrase, isn't it? To settle down or to settle in to one's life more firmly. And this usually entails, I think, at least 3 things. In other words, what I begin to do, hopefully, or feel it necessary to do in the late 30s, is to begin to settle into my life structure a little more firmly and consciously. I think it requires three things. It requires, first of all, settling on priorities. I begin to settle on what the priorities of my life will be. I begin to become aware of the fact that there are limited options in life. I can't do it all. I only have so much time and so much energy. What do I really want to give my time and my energy to? And it invites one to reinvest oneself perhaps in relationship, or to reinvest oneself in one's work in a fuller way, or maybe to get more connected, reconnected to one's faith life, one's church life. But I need to establish for myself priorities. The alternative is a rather scattered life, that sooner or later proves unsatisfying. So in other words, I begin to accept the fact at this point in my life that there are limits, that I have to close some doors in order to open some others. I don't know if I'm sure you've seen a lot of these interviews that are done on television. These drive me crazy. But they're done usually right after the Olympics, and they're always interviewing the person that won the gold medal, or they're very much like the interviews done after the Super Bowl. And they had the team there in the locker room that just won the Super Bowl or won the World Series. And invariably, the kinds of things you keep hearing, or I think I keep hearing, is somebody says, this just goes to show you that anything is possible as long as you put your mind to it. You can achieve anything you want. And I always find myself thinking, well, where in the world are the other 99.9 people who didn't win the gold medal, or who aren't in the locker room? What happened to them? And isn't it quite obviously the case that not everything is possible? We can't do it all or accomplish it all. And I believe that's the realization that hopefully we really embrace in these late 30s. I can't do it all. Not everything is possible. And so I have to establish what priorities I'm going to go with in my life. That's one phase of this. The second phase I would mention is the need to develop skills. Part of settling into my life is developing skills that I need but that I do not possess. And it will always be the case in our lives that we don't have some of the skills that we need. It might be relational skills. I don't have the communication skills that I need. And so maybe I need to get immersed in marriage encounter or some other type of movement that will assist me in acquiring those skills. So if I'm dealing well with the challenges of life, I'll recognize there's some skills I don't have. Or maybe I discover that I really am computer illiterate in my work. And if I'm going to settle into my life's work or life's career, I need to develop skills there. So if I'm dealing honestly with my life at this time, I'll recognize the skills I do not possess, and I'll strive to develop those. And lastly, I would like to suggest that settling down or settling into one's life means becoming, and this may sound vague, becoming interdependent. Becoming interdependent. Now, Daniel Levinson refers to this as becoming your own person or becoming independent, but I like the word interdependent much more. And it means two things. It means, first of all, I've reached that point in my life where I don't slavishly depend upon the approval and the support and the guidance of others. I begin to get a little free of that. I'm not dependent on having the approval, the agreement, the guidance, the support of others. I begin in that respect to become my own person. But I believe it doesn't mean becoming totally independent. It means being interdependent. I can rely on others, and I know that I will always need to rely on others without slavishly becoming dependent on them. And that's a task that hopefully begins to be experienced in these late 30s, so that I can then more uniquely, confidently, and consciously pursue my life's direction. So those are the spiritual tasks that I would like to share with you tonight. We could sum it all up by saying, if a person negotiates perfectly well, those three tasks we talked about last week, the three tasks of early adulthood, and then negotiates perfectly well the 5 tasks of early adulthood, they will enter into the turbulent mid-years with no problems at all. However, that does not seem to happen. And so that's why so often today we find those middle years, those mid-years referred to as the turbulent years. So next week, with appropriate trepidation, we will begin to step into the tasks of the mid-years.
All rights to this talk are reserved by St. Anthony Messenger Press, 1615 Republic Street, Cincinnati, Ohio, 45210.